Good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's MDICx webinar. My name is Stephanie Christopher. I am MDIC's Program Director for the Science of Patient Input, and I'm so excited to be able to share this webinar with all of you today. Today's webinar, Designing Patient-Centered Clinical Trials, Results of the MDIC Project to Use Patient Preference Information to Design Clinical Trials, is our opportunity to share the results of a nearly 2-year collaborative project that MDIC has been engaged in with a number of key partners, including CDRH, MIT, RTI Health Solutions, and the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research. Today's speakers will be sharing the results from the first 3 aims of the study, and we're delighted to be able to share what we've learned in advancing this method to integrate patient perspectives into how we design clinical trials. Our speakers today are Annie Saha from the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, Brett Haber from RTI Health Solutions, and Shomesh Chowdhury from MIT's Laboratory for Financial Engineering. And with that, I will turn it over to Annie.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thank you everyone for joining. I look forward to presenting some of our work. Hopefully I can get the IT. There we go. So I'm going to be talking about the first step of the project, which was how do we incorporate patient-centered clinical outcomes in the clinical trial design. And to start, I'll frame sort of the overall project, and then you'll hear from Brett Haber and Shomesh Chowdhury on the specifics of the aim 2 and aim 3 as they go forward. So ultimately, this project was really designed to see, can we take patient values into account as we are developing clinical trials and optimize clinical trial design so that clinical trials really take the patient perspective into account. And so the specific aims of this project were to identify the outcomes that are most important to patients, which I'll focus my part of the presentation on, then design and conduct a patient preference study using those outcomes that are important to patients, which ultimately is used to design some methods for a clinical trial based on explicit patient input. And then ultimately, and part of this webinar is to assess the medical device stakeholder acceptance and really communicate the results of this project to the community. Stephanie, it is being slow. It's not moving. Oh, there we go.
There you go. And Annie, can you move a little closer to the microphone or to your phone set? I'm hearing some feedback that you're a little hard to hear.
Oh, sure. Is that better?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. So the aim 1 of the project is really to focus on what are the outcomes that are most important to patients. So we did this through a process of really looking at multiple different sources of information and ultimately, most importantly, from patients. So we reviewed literature as well as previous clinical studies. We held conversations and discussions with the Michael J. Fox Foundation, one of our integral partners to this project, patient scientists, as well as a survey of their patient council. Then we also coordinated with FDA reviewers in the neurology division at CDRH to ensure that the patient preference study was both going to be useful from a patient perspective, but also from a regulatory perspective. And then the outputs of this aim is ultimately to lead to the benefits and risks that would be considered in the patient preference study that Brett will talk about. So the process we went through to identify the outcomes that are most important were, first we started by, we went through sort of a 4-step iterative process where first we identified what was important. So that primarily was from the FDA side of looking at the literature, refining that information, prioritizing what was most important, and then ultimately defining what those outcomes really meant to then be used for the patient preference study. And I'll walk through what each of these steps look like. So for the first step of identifying what was important to patients, or identifying the outcomes, we really looked at the preliminary list of potential attributes, primarily through a literature review. This work was done through searching the literature, PubMed Central, clinicaltrials.gov, other FDA-approved drugs and devices in the Parkinson space, and those types of information. And ultimately, that led to a whole host of different attributes or different benefits and risks that we saw all across the board that could have some groupings in some of these different areas, but there was really a lot out there that we were trying to get a picture of and really glean from. And even with that, all of those attributes here, we still realized there were still attributes that were important to patients that weren't even captured currently in the literature. So that was really why the next step in the process was so important, which was to work with the patient scientists. I'm hoping that the screen will catch up at some point. Sorry, seems to be a little slow. The next step was to go through and continue to Stephanie, do you think you could advance? Refine the outcomes that were refine the outcomes that were important to patients. And this was working with the patients, our physicians, reviewers, and CDRH, as well as the other sponsors of the project. And with that, we really sat down with the patients and the other stakeholders to really refine and clarify the different attributes through those discussion groups and focus groups, and really understand what was most important, especially from the patient perspective, as well as also what's important from the FDA reviewer perspective when looking at Parkinson's disease clinical trials. So in terms of refining the outcomes, the main questions we really asked were, what's most important, what can we measure, understanding how do patients feel, and what's currently being done in the process. So we had a lot of different risks that we were looking at, and this is just an example at the bottom of sort of how we went into the refining process of taking different attributes that were similar and trying to couple those, and then looking at those different types of risks, and also sort of the commonalities, as well as how often we were seeing those different risks in clinical trials or in the literature, and sort of classifying those into different areas. So, and then ultimately leading to some clinical endpoint that was important from all stakeholders. So in this case, the example is we looked at different types of risks, and ultimately what came out to be one of the more important risks to make sure that we included as an attribute was brain bleed. And so from there, we really then needed to prioritize the attributes because our list was very, very long, and there was no way we could do a patient preference survey with all of that information. So with patients and physicians, we worked to prioritize those different attributes and really understand which ones are going to be the most important. And we were able to get data to show the areas that were the most important to patients. And one of the nice findings about that was that we were able to see different attributes and see areas that maybe have been underserved in previous clinical trial design or in previous medical products that are currently available in the Parkinson's area. So just an example of the survey results where we saw that the things that were most important were movement, which is something we've seen a lot in the literature, but an underserved area really has been in the psychological and cognitive effects of Parkinson's disease. And that was also very important to patients. And that's really an important piece of information that we may have missed if we had only done a literature review and not actually worked with patients in the process. Then ultimately, we took that prioritization information and then had to work to refine and figure out how we were going to actually define what those attributes meant. So with that, we really tried to develop unbiased patient-centered descriptions, and we used a discussion group with the patients as well as our FDA reviewers and physicians and the different project groups to really try to hone in and make sure we were having clear descriptions of what those attributes for both benefits and risks were. And ultimately, that process also led us to taking to account multiple different areas that were related to movement, but rather than having separate attributes for falls, impairment, bradykinesia, resting tremor, stiffness, rigidity, etc. Through the discussions and work, we were able to determine and make that into one single attribute related to movement symptoms and cover a lot of what was really important to the patient's perspective. And with that, we had the resulting benefits and risks that ultimately fed into the patient preference study. These were looking at on time, decreasing motor symptoms, decreasing Parkinson's disease pain, which is another area that we didn't see too much in the literature, but really by working with patients and having the patient scientists at the table was something that we made sure was part of the patient preference study, as well as cognitive impairment and a decrease in medication side effects. And then the burdens or risks were about worsening depression or anxiety, severe adverse events, which was brain bleed, and then an increase in mortality risk. And with that, I will turn it over to Brett Hauber to talk about the patient preference study in AIM-2.
Great, thanks, Annie. Let's see if I can. See if that'll move ahead from here. Oh, there we go. Okay. So, as Annie had described, there was a lot of work that went into determining what actually went into the patient preference study. And then what I'll describe now is how we took that information and what we did with it in order to inform AIM-3, which is the design of the clinical trials. So our first objective here was to estimate the benefit risk preferences for the different attributes of potential device treatments and to provide the input into the model in AIM-3, which Sho will describe in just a minute. And we looked at both the benefits and the risks, but we also needed to include a time component because the model required that we include a discount rate. So in addition to what Annie has already demonstrated with regard to the benefits and risks that we included in the study, we also needed to include an additional exercise for a time trade-off to get at those discount rates. And then there was a third objective that we're really not going to talk much about today, but that was to actually take the survey that we have and not only put the data and the results on the Fox Insight platform so that they are available to other researchers in the future, but also to develop a survey in such a way that it could remain an enduring part of the Fox Insight platform so that Fox Insight could continue to use that survey and administer it to new people as they came into the Fox Insight platform and potentially to use it longitudinally. So that is another thing that we've always kept in mind as we've been developing this survey that we won't talk much about today, but I think is a really important component to this study. So the process, as Annie had already described, was to start from the patient preference perspective, was to start with the list of benefits and risks that were identified in AIM-1. And Annie talked about developing the definitions and the descriptions for each of the attributes. We worked with Michael J. Fox Foundation Patient Council, as well as FDA reviewers and staff to do that. Together, the study team developed the patient preference survey, and critical in that was getting input from the FDA reviewers, both from a clinical perspective to make sure that what we included in here was clinically accurate, but also that it was described in such a way that would be relevant to a decision and the type of evidence that they would expect to see. So that was a key component here that was a real advantage of collaborating with CDRH on this, was we got that very important perspective here, which really has a lot to do with the relevance from the decision-making perspective. Then, once we had all of the clinical and methodological people get their input into developing the survey, we conducted 20 pre-test interviews with people with Parkinson's, and they were recruited and scheduled through the Michael J. Fox Foundation. And these were people with pretty diverse backgrounds in terms of their disease experience, as well as their geographic location and race and ethnicity. And they were really interesting interviews, but what they helped us to do was take something that we had that answered the research question that we were interested in, using the benefits and risks that had been identified previously, and help us get it in a way that made sense to patients, where patients were able to tell us, in fact, what their risk tolerance was and what the value to them was of the different benefits that we included. And then ultimately, this was programmed as an online survey that was administered to participants in Fox Insight. So the survey itself included the benefits and risks, and I'll sort of show how we built that up. These are the same benefits that Annie showed before, and where we wound up with this was that for every individual, we showed them a 50% improvement in each of these benefits from their baseline level, so that for any individual, we don't get necessarily the differential values of differential benefits for that individual, but we had a fairly large sample. So over the cross-section of people, we're able to see different actual magnitudes in value corresponding to a 50% improvement in any one of these symptoms, because we had a lot of different baselines. Then in terms of the burdens, we call them burdens instead of risks when we talk about this in general, because we have the 3 risks that Annie mentioned, but we also include wait time so that we can get at the discounting factor that's going to be important for the model. And the starting levels for the risks are the levels that are most likely or would be expected to be seen by the reviewers if they were to see an application for a new neurostimulation device based on their prior experience and the mechanism of action. So essentially, we're starting with a number when we talk about the risks that is what people would expect to see if they were to see a neurostimulation device. And that's important because starting point bias can be an issue in the threshold technique. So what we want to do is make sure that our starting point represents what we expect reality to look like. So using the threshold technique, we present respondents with 2 alternatives. The first is what we call a reference condition, which is the standard of care or current treatment or no treatment. And then we have a target, and that's what we're really interested in here. And that is the hypothetical alternative that is defined by the attributes and levels for the benefits and the risks. So we ask patients then to choose between the reference and the target treatment, and then we vary something in the target treatment to the point where we see the person actually switch their choice. And that tells us where the threshold is for that particular key element that we are looking at. So this is an example of what a threshold technique question might look like. And in this case, you can see here on the left that we have our 5 benefits. We have the 3 risks. And in this case, we start with the new device, the target device, offering a 50% improvement in movement symptoms from the baseline, and starting with a 20% risk of new or worsening depression or anxiety. And based on their choice to the first question, we then vary systematically this risk of new or worsening depression or anxiety until the person switches. And then that becomes the threshold that offsets the improvement in motor symptoms. And then we do that for different pairs of benefits and risks. This is what the time trade-off question essentially looks like. It's simpler in design. It doesn't have to be, but the way that we did this, we made it simpler in design to basically say, for any improvement, like in this case in movement symptoms, would you prefer to have a small improvement today, or would you prefer to wait and have a larger improvement? And then that allows us to look at the time preferences for that improvement, which is important as I imagine Sho will explain to you, because this helps us understand how critical the need is at the moment for relief that influences the patient's perspective on the availability of the technology, which influences then the trial design. So here are the results that we got. We got a pretty reasonable age, a good distribution between men and women, an employment number that looks reasonable to us. Where we are skewed in our distribution is that most of our respondents tend to be Caucasian. We have underrepresentation of racial and ethnic minorities, which is consistent with where the Fox Insight membership was at the time. But I believe that is changing, but it is not representative necessarily of the population of people with Parkinson's disease in the United States. We also tended to have more highly educated people, again, reflective of what Fox Insight looked like at the time of the survey, but not necessarily representative of the general population. When we looked at people's self-reported symptoms of Parkinson's disease, we have both the number reporting symptoms, and what was really important here, you'll see that almost everybody reported movement symptoms, but not everybody reported that they had off time every day, which was a bit of a surprise to me until we talked with the patient scientists who were part of our team who said, no, in fact, that is the case. One of the things we see here reflects that this is a pretty heterogeneous disease, which as a layperson from a medical perspective was news to me and interesting to me to learn, and we see it reflected in the data. And then we have, for each person who has these symptoms, we ask them to rate the severity of their symptoms or the hours of off time that they have each day. We also then looked at other characteristics related to Parkinson's disease, the number of pills taken per day to treat Parkinson's or to treat the side effects of Parkinson's medications, year since diagnosis. What has turned out to be a key one is whether a person has had prior deep brain stimulation. And then we also asked whether a person had a biological relative who had Parkinson's disease. We want to know also people's experience with the risk outcomes, because it may in fact be that people who have had experience, let's say with depression or anxiety or a brain bleed in the past, would view that risk systematically differently than someone who doesn't have that experience. So it was important for us to also capture that information. So this is a very crude top-level type result that we get, where we get to relate the benefit, which in this case is the increase in on-time hours per day going from few to more. This would represent then the 50% increase in benefit on average. That's why the maximum is 8, because that was the maximum benefit that people could see. And then corresponding with that, the maximum acceptable risk. So in general, what we found and we expected to find is that risk tolerance increases as the benefit increases, and risk tolerance is higher for new or worsening depression, which is than it is for brain bleed, which the risk tolerance for brain bleed is higher than the risk of death. Then we get to look at how this varies across the different benefits, and we see kind of what we expected to see. What stood out here was that cognition, improvements in cognition, tended to have higher risk tolerance than for the other benefits. So I was a little bit surprised to see this myself, and it's not statistically significantly different in most cases, but at the mean is definitely larger here. And what that means is a 50% improvement in memory and thinking problems is more important to this group of patients, on average, than a 50% improvement in movement symptoms, on time, or pain. We found that on-time movement and pain were about the same as each other, and that preferences for reducing the number of pills indicated that that benefit was less important than the others. One of the nice things about this particular study is that we are able then to regress the risk tolerance that we have on individual patient characteristics. So the orange here corresponds essentially to what we saw before for each of the benefits, where we have no covariates. We just literally figure out what the mean risk tolerance is over the population. But when we start to look at subgroups, we looked at people who did not have ambulatory problems, because people can have movement symptoms or not. And if they have movement symptoms, they may or may not impact their ambulation or their ambulatory ability. So we looked at those without ambulatory ability, and those are in green. We also looked at people who had reported cognition problems previously to see whether their risk tolerance was different for anything, in this case, other than cognition, because the people who got an improvement in cognition were only those people who had cognitive problems. So that's why you don't see a blue line there. What is particularly interesting in here is, even though we had a relatively small number of people who had prior DBS, we begin to see that those people tend to have somewhat greater risk tolerance than the people who don't have prior experience with deep brain stimulation. And so that's good on that one. Let's move on then too. So here again we have the subgroups that we defined before, the ambulatory, the cognition, and the deep brain stimulation, but we've divided these up by age groups. One of the things that we found here was consistently, no matter how we modeled the data, age was one of the most significant predictors of risk tolerance throughout the study, and that was robust almost regardless of specification of the model. So what we see here is, particularly just looking at this age group and looking at those who are non-ambulatory, we begin to find that they have the highest risk tolerance in this particular case for mortality risk to improve pain. And there are corresponding graphs like this for every single combination of benefit and risk. But what happens is we begin to look at this as we begin to see different groups stand out. And that's where I think a lot of the interesting things are in this study. So, to really sum it up, and it was hard to sum this up, frankly, because we have so much data and we have so many interesting findings about how people with different characteristics view different benefit risk trade-offs. But in general, I think what we can say here is, not surprisingly, people with Parkinson's disease are willing to accept device-related risks of those traditional outcomes that we would see in existing trials that are so typically on time and movement symptoms. But what we also see is that pain and cognition are two very important endpoints for patients, and the risk tolerance that they have in order to achieve benefits in these areas is pretty high. We also see that the people with DBS on average, and this is a pretty consistent result no matter how we analyze the data, they have a somewhat greater risk tolerance for all benefits, for all risks, than those who have not had DBS. So that prior experience with a neurostimulation device actually does seem to matter. And as I mentioned before, no matter how we analyze the data, risk tolerance varies consistently with patient age. So that is one of the key factors in determining the value of benefits to patients is directly related to patient age. And with that, I'll turn it over to Shel.
Great. Thank you, Brett. So as a quick introduction, my name is Shamesh Chowdhury. I am a postdoc in the Laboratory for Financial Engineering at MIT. And so the topic that I'm going to talk about now is how can we incorporate those patient preferences that Brett just described into the design of clinical trials. So I'll begin with a quick review of clinical trials as soon as this slide changes. There we go. So as a review of clinical trials, one of the main goals of a clinical trial is to reduce the number of mistakes we make in the form of type 1 and type 2 error. And so a type 1 error occurs when we approve an ineffective therapy. And so this can be problematic because these therapies might also be associated with negative side effects. And so typically what's done is we try to set the type 1 error rate to something like 2.5 or 5%. And then we look for therapies that have p-values less than this threshold. On the other hand, we can also make a second type of mistake, and that's also known as type 2 error. And that occurs when we reject an effective therapy. And so we also want to try to avoid making this type of mistake. But it turns out actually that for a fixed sample size for a clinical trial, there's actually a trade-off between the type 1 and type 2 error. And so the question we want to be able to answer is how can we design this trade-off in such a way that takes into consideration these patient preferences? And so a former student in our lab, the LFE, Vahid Montazer Hojat, along with Leah Isakov and Professor Lowe, decided to approach this problem through the lens of Bayesian decision analysis, BDA for short. And so in their analysis, they considered fixed sample, balanced, two-arm randomized clinical trials. And so what this means is that in this trial, half of the patients are going to be assumed to receive the investigational therapy, and the other half of patients are going to receive some form of control treatment. And so this framework can actually be summarized by this figure below. So on the x-axis, we have our statistic, which summarizes the amount of clinical evidence in the trial that supports our hypothesis that our investigational therapy is more effective than our control. And so what we can do is at the end of the trial, we calculate the statistic, and if it falls to the right of our decision boundary, lambda, then we say this therapy has met its primary endpoint for efficacy. If, however, it falls to the left side of this decision boundary, then we say that it's failed to meet its endpoint. And so in the example that I have shown here, our decision threshold lambda is set to 1.65, such that the probability of a type 1 error, the probability of a false approval, is set to 5%. So this is also known as the statistical significance of the test. On the other hand, the probability of a type 2 error, the probability of a false rejection, is given by the area in yellow, denoted by beta. And so this is also known as 1 minus the statistical power of the test. And so now what we can do is we can incorporate an additional dimension into this analysis, and we can use our patient preference information to indicate the severity from the patient perspective of a type 1 versus a type 2 error. And so in this example, the red color indicates that a type 1 error, from the patient perspective, the severity of that type 1 error might be greater than the severity of a type 2 error. And so now what we can do is we can readjust this decision threshold and we can set it to a new value such that we're minimizing the average harm to patients. And so that's also going to be equivalent to maximizing expected patient value. Now, in addition to this trade-off between type 1 error and type 2 error, as Brett was describing, the BDA framework can also takes into consideration the trade-off between the length of the clinical trial, which is also going to be related to the number of patients in the trial, and the overall error rate. And so what the optimization attempts to do is it tries to optimize over these parameters, n, the number of patients in our trial, and lambda, our decision threshold, such that we're minimizing the average harm to patients. And so this figure on the right of this slide here is just an illustration of how this optimization attempts to search for these optimal trial design parameters. Now, what we do in this case study analysis is we implement this Bayesian decision analysis framework using the patient preference information that Brett described earlier to design optimal clinical trials from the patient perspective for a hypothetical neurostimulation device. And so the figure that we have illustrated here shows these BDA optimal clinical trials for different subgroups of Parkinson's patients. And so at the left of this chart, we have patients with relatively mild symptoms who have no prior experience with deep brain stimulation. And moving along to the very far right side of this chart, we have patients with more severe symptoms and also patients that have prior experience with deep brain stimulation. And so what we see on the right side of this chart for patients that have relatively high risk tolerance, the optimal decision for our trial design is to keep these trials relatively small so that we can get new therapies out to patients sooner. And moreover, the type 1 error rate is set to about 9%, which is substantially greater than the traditional value of 5%. On the other hand, if we look at the left side of this chart, for patients with less severe symptoms who tend to be more risk averse, here the optimal decision is to design a relatively conservative trial. And so here we see that we're getting p-values on the order of about 1 to 2%. So just to quickly summarize these key findings, what we've seen is that a fixed significance level of 5% doesn't necessarily maximize patient value. And specifically for our more risk-tolerant patients, such as patients with more severe symptoms, value ends up being lost due to lengthy clinical trials that are too conservative and overprotective of the type 1 error rate. On the other hand, for patients with less severe symptoms who tend to be more risk averse, here the traditional thresholds of 5% might actually be too permissive. And this might be especially the case when the investigational therapy, like neurostimulation devices, has a substantial risk profile. And so with that, I'd like to pause there and hand control back over to Stephanie, because I believe we have some time for questions.
Yes, thank you, Shao. Encourage you, those of you who are listening, if you have questions, please use the chat box or the Q&A box on Zoom to submit your questions. While we're waiting for some first questions to come in, I'd like to ask all three of you to maybe comment a little bit on or share a little bit more about the role of our patient scientists on this project and what specifically you learned from the patients as we developed the study at these 3 different points that we've explored today. So maybe Annie, we can start with you.
Sure. I think, well, most importantly, patients are really the expert in their disease and condition. Heather Benz, one of the folks from CDRH who was part of this project, I had a similar quote a couple of months ago when we were presenting in Philadelphia, and she said, I have a PhD in biomedical engineering. That's my area of expertise. Patients and our patient scientists are the ones with the PhD in Parkinson's disease and their experience with that. And so they were at the table along with everybody else and part of the team. And that was crucially important to, from the very beginning, in terms of how do we look at and prioritize and determine which attributes are most important. The regulatory perspective is important, but we needed to make sure that we weren't missing things and not just doing what we've always been doing. And there were quite a few areas where there was unmet need. We saw that in the cognition and what Brett walked through further on the patient preference study results, as well as the real underrepresentation, the real lack of any kind of measurement for pain in Parkinson's disease. And we wouldn't have had any of that information if we hadn't included the Michael J. Fox patient scientist. I guess I'll turn it over to Brett.
Yep, sure. I'm glad you mentioned that, Stephanie, and I actually feel badly that we didn't mention that more as we were discussing this, because we had the patient scientists with us every step of the way, and they were critical to the success of this particular project, and I would think to any project, because so often during the course of our discussions, we would, the non-Parkinson's experts would be talking about things in a way that made perfect sense to us. And what we often heard was that we didn't quite get it. And, that was so important for us to understand, because when we're asking questions of people to try and understand something, there is this assumption that they're answering the question that we are asking. And if they're answering something different than what we are asking, that's on us. That's our fault as the researchers, not the respondents' fault. And what the patient scientists were able to say to us was, you think you're saying this, but you're missing this point, and so therefore a patient is going to see it like this. So that was one of the critical aspects in the patient preference survey. But also, I think when we develop these types of surveys, we make assumptions about our knowledge about Parkinson's. And like Annie mentioned, Heather's comment about not having a PhD in Parkinson's and only a patient could be considered to be the expert, that type of information is critical. And so the patient scientists here were involved every step of the way, and we had, especially two great people who were involved in all of the nitty-gritty details, and they taught us along the way, and they were critical to the success of the project. So it has certainly changed how I view doing this type of research, because I now know how little I know, and how important it is to have that patient perspective to ensure that we are actually measuring what we think we're measuring. So I can't speak highly enough, not to mention they're just wonderful people, and I cherish the relationships that we've developed from a scientific perspective. It's absolutely crucial.
Right, and just to kind of add to what Annie and Brett have already mentioned, they've kind of been critical every step along the way. And in terms of the statistical models in designing clinical trials, these models are only ever going to be as useful as or as good as the inputs that you provide them. And so without that critical input in terms of what benefits and risks are important to patients that we ultimately measure and then feed into these types of models, without that critical input, our results would be a lot less accurate and helpful. And so just to emphasize, their contribution has been absolutely critical in helping us kind of every step along the way, including with the more statistical aspects of the model as well. So, right.
Great, thanks, Joe. I have a question about the preference study. The confidence intervals on the preference estimates are surprisingly large for an N of 2,700. How confident are you about the conclusion?
Oh, that's a really good observation. I think one of the reasons in this particular case that the confidence intervals are wide is because we're taking a wide range of benefits and distilling it down to the mean. Where we see tighter confidence intervals is when we do two things. One, we look at specific levels of benefit, and when we start adjusting for some of these critical covariates. So I think as we continue to look at these data and nail things down, what this tells us is when we try to generalize and come up with sort of the grand conclusion, we're going to have these wide confidence intervals because the data aren't amenable to that, and we have significant heterogeneity within the population. So what we need to do is we need to focus in on some of the more specifics in terms of the specific levels of benefit and the trade-offs for that level of benefit, as well as to control for the heterogeneity that we see across the population.
Great, thanks, Brett. So I have a couple of questions here on how this would potentially translate to other conditions. First question, and I think perhaps Andy, I'll maybe start with you on this. In order to translate this to other conditions, would the first step be a patient preference initiative, or is there a way to translate this into FDA decision making on a broad basis?
I think there's two pieces to that question. So for the first part, if you wanted to incorporate the patient preferences into a clinical trial design to further incorporate the patient values, ensure that you have a patient-centered clinical trial design, you would probably need some kind of patient preference study. More broadly, certainly the clinical trial method that Show walked through with or without patient preferences is something that CDRH is always open to discussing with review teams. The review teams are always willing to discuss and talk about novel clinical trial methods and how we can use new science and new methods to advance device development and assessment so that products come to market that are actually going to help patients.
Great, thanks, Annie. And a second question kind of related to that: how has this changed has this changed how FDA, reviews their review criteria based on this new knowledge about patient preferences?
Well, since we put out our 2012 benefit risk guidance, we did have a placeholder about patient preferences and understanding what patients care about in terms of their perspectives on benefit and on potential risks. And so that's been part of our benefit risk assessments over time. We are continuing to encourage that sponsors, patient groups, and we are also fostering in activities like this, patient preference studies, so that we can further truly understand from the patient perspective what's important. And I think our previous comments where we really talked about the importance of the patient scientist in this work, it just goes to show that importance of that patient preference and patient perspective in our decision making. And certainly we've had the examples obesity devices, as well as the next phase home hemodialysis system expanded indication as some clear examples of actually using patient preferences as part of our benefit risk assessment.
Great, thanks, Annie.
And really for both, whether companies or patient groups, whoever, if you're interested in doing a patient preference study or interested in a new type of clinical trial design, really encourage you come talk to CDRH early in the pre-submission process to discuss that, so we can provide our feedback and input.
Great. wondering if, and I'll pose this maybe to the three of you, what has so we presented these results at a workshop in May, and one of the things that we all talked about on the course of this project going into it was that we knew there was going to have to be a fair amount of education about this method as we released the results to really get buy-in to it. What has been some of the reaction that you've received in the months since we first started sharing these results in May to this method, or what are some of the key questions that you're getting about this model?
Well, this is Annie. I think the questions we just got are pretty illustrative of the types of questions that we've gotten on the FDA side, and that certainly, one aspect too, I think that's important for this project, that there is a science behind it, and there's a transparent sort of systematic process that this went through, so it can provide some confidence to people as they are reviewing the science behind it of how we went about it. So it provides some additional confidence in that information.
And a lot of the questions, this is Brett, a lot of the questions that I've heard are, so what does this mean for FDA? And that's when I have to say, talk to Annie, because certainly I can't answer that question. But on the side, or in a different vein of conversation, in talking with people who take the perspective of a patient organization, the question has become, what is the use of this for a patient organization, sort of independent of FDA? And, I mentioned before about developing this as a survey that can be continued as part of the Fox Insight program, but also, the Fox Insight database is a database that can be made available to researchers. And one of the things that, it's not that it never happens, but it is happens less often than not that these data get provided for other people to take a look at. And so it's not up on the Fox Insight platform yet, but these data will be available for other researchers to look at. And there's a lot in there that we're not able to get to. So I think one of the other things about working with an organization like Michael J. Fox Foundation is that we can say, okay, we've done what we can with these data, with the resources and the time that we have, but there's lots more in there, and we know there are a number of other researchers who are interested in this stuff from lots of different perspectives, and we'll be able to make those data available. So, that's something that's really nice to be able to say, and we hope that these could be used, the preference data at least can be used for other purposes than we may even have ever thought about. So I think that's another advantage of this program that gets to what is some of the value to the patient partner group in this, sort of beyond where everything else has sort of been leading to the science of patient input focus from FDA's perspective. There is something that we feel like we've been able to contribute to the database and the stock of knowledge that the patient group, the Michael J. Fox Foundation, can provide as part of its mission to promote research throughout all of the areas of relevant Parkinson's research.
And hi, this is Joe here. And from kind of the Bayesian decision analysis framework perspective, some of the questions that I've been getting on my end has been related to how can we actually apply this, systematic and transparent technique for thinking about decision thresholds and p-values. How can it be applied to different frameworks of clinical trials? So the example that I presented here was kind of the most simple case where you have a balanced fixed sample, 2-arm randomized clinical trial. And so one of the things that we're working on here is how can we incorporate kind of these types of ideas into Bayesian adaptive frameworks and other innovative frameworks that that have recently gained popularity. All right. And so actually, just to mention something on that front, we've been working on that side. And so hopefully we should be able to present some of the results for applying these kind of techniques to a Bayesian adaptive or adaptive protocol, you know, in the near future.
Great, great, thank you. Well, I want to thank our speakers today for sharing on this really terrific project. I encourage you to join us. We have a couple more webinars on the schedule, including our next webinar will be on the Case for Quality initiative coming up on September 12th. And encourage you to join us. MDIC is hosting its annual public forum on September 5th. This is a great day-long gathering where we will be sharing all across all of MDIC's projects to advance regulatory science, and we'll hear from some great speakers and some great panel presentations on all of the work MDIC does to advance innovative methods like the ones we've talked about today. So thank you to our speakers, and thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Stephanie.